Chief Washington correspondent and Face the Nation moderator John Dickerson is in Washington. So, John, give us some context here. How did the president's remarks Tuesday compare to what we've heard over the past couple of days?
Well, they were closer to, in tone and feeling, to what he said on Saturday, which was essentially that he has, at some level, an interest in arguing that it wasn't just the neo-Nazis and alt-right protesters, but that it was that there was a contribution from the left as well. And so, while the other day he had talked about, finally amended his remarks and talked about how evil racism and the neo-Nazism was, this seemed to be kind of shifting back off of that and closer to his remarks on Saturday.
So, John, we had a conversation on Monday with a conservative columnist for the Boston Herald, Michael Graham, and he described his evangelical parents in South Carolina, for instance, finding discomfort with the president's initial remarks on Saturday, a great deal of it, and his point being that there is now a threat to the president's base. How do you think the way this has unfolded will affect the president's standing with that core group of supporters who have stood by the president for the most part up until this point?
Well, we'll have to see. As you pointed out, they are a very durable part of his constituency. Now, his ratings have been dropping, and so he has already been in difficulty with a little bit of difficulty with his base, or difficulty that people might have thought he never would have had. So the problem here is that that these are, when you talk about neo-Nazis, it's just hard to get on the other side of that. So we'll have to see what happens with his base. The bigger thing to look for next is the defections and statements from Republicans in his own party, because this is not just one set of comments from Saturday. He has now sort of repeated this message twice. And the issue here is one of emphasis. The president is focused on the fact that there were both sides contributing to this. That's really secondary to the larger point, which is that the people who are racists and bigots who are marching, that they are totally at odds with the founding ideas of the country that he is the leader of, and that we expect a president in these kinds of moments to unify, not to kind of keep and carry on an argument. And so Republican leaders now, it's not just the specifics of this moment they have to worry about. It's basically waiting for the next one like this to happen. There's been a kind of steady trajectory in the Trump presidency of things the president has said that has made Republican lawmakers nervous. This one is the biggest and most recent challenge. And so if that is the next, if we see more of that, then you could really see even greater erosion, because it means the president's political success was built on a base, but then some number of Republicans saying he was worth the shot, worth the chance. And that's the group of Republicans that's at risk here in this first stage of reaction to these sets of remarks.
And finally, John, drawing on your expertise in American political history, the president seemed to compare taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee to taking down a statue of George Washington. How does that comparison hold up?
Well, as our good friend Jonathan Horn, the historian and biographer of Lee, pointed out, Lee was not even a fan of monuments about the Confederate fighting. So there is that's one important note, because a lot of people are arguing that keeping the monuments up is keeping faith with the history of the Confederacy. That obviously there is some debate about that, because a lot of these monuments went up during the Civil Rights era and not during the period after the war. But the distinction between General Washington and Robert E. Lee, who is not even referred to as a general at West Point, where he attended, but he's not referred to as a general because he was a general of the Confederate Army, which was in open rebellion against the Union. So a general of a Union that was in rebellion against its country is very different than the founder of the country, George Washington, whose history is a little broader in terms of its greatness, in terms of being the founding president of a country who set the example of the way presidents are supposed to behave. So the equivalence there, it is, people make this argument, but they're two very different people engaged in two very different pursuits, although George Washington was a slave owner.
All right. John Dickerson in Washington for us. John, thank you.
Thanks, Elaine.